The NVA kept coming amid the explosions in fire-team-sized rushes, and Lieutenant King, Bravo 2, decided to tighten up their perimeter along the road. Getting a hold of Sergeant Hilliard through the 81mm FO's radioman, he told him to pull Lance Corporal Herbert's point squad back with him. "Let's go." Hilliard turned, shouted, and started back. Herbert yelled to his Marines, and they started running to the rear in a loose file, Herbert up with Hilliard and their corpsmen. They made some 30 meters, then suddenly, Hilliard jumped toward a hole just as a Chicom grenade landed beside him. Boom! Herbert was sent sprawling. Then he instantly crawled into a small hole that his radioman had already found. The corpsman ran to the hole too, bleeding from a small shrapnel wound to the head and shouting that Sergeant Hilliard had been killed instantly by the grenade. Kia! Automatic weapons began scything the grass from all directions. The NVA were already upon them, and as the squad returned fire, Herbert passed the word up and down the line to see if anyone was in contact with the other squads. No one was. Herbert's radio was already kaput, and the 81mm FO's radioman had taken a big chunk of shrapnel in his. So they had no more commo with anyone. Herbert reckoned his position to be about 20 meters east of the road, but he didn't know if his platoon was dead, still in position, or if they'd pulled back and left them. He did not know how many NVA were in the area. He did not know anything. There was another AK-47 burst and, instantly, an inhuman scream, followed by shouts to Herbert that one of their guys was hit. Herbert sent his superficially wounded corpsman in that direction, but he was shot in the legs as he ran and sent sprawling. The next shot was to his head. Kia! There was a shout to Herbert that it was the point man Lapinto who had screamed. That was Herbert's best friend, and he shouted back to ask how bad he was hit. The return shout was that he was dead. Kia! Everyone was basically facing forward, except for a few who had turned around to return the fire coming from their rear. Herbert called again for the men on the right and left flanks to see if they could make contact with any other friendlies. Again, they could not, so the 81mm FO told his radioman to take off his useless radio, crawl back, and re-establish contact with the platoon. The man came running back very shortly, saying that no one was behind them but NVA. Here we are, Herbert thought. NVA to our front, NVA to our rear, and the NVA we can't see who are all around us. Lance Corporal Herbert passed the word for the squad to pull back into a tighter perimeter so they could at least all see each other. He didn't need any NVA getting in the brush between his squad's two-man positions. He then told his radioman, who had unshouldered his 25 pounds of malfunctioning junk, to take the radio with him and pull back to the left as he, Herbert, went to the right around a tree in their path. The radioman got up and started crawling on all fours, dragging the radio behind him, while Herbert went on a belly crawl and there was an AK-47 crack and the radioman collapsed, killed instantly by a square shot to the neck. Kia! Slowly but surely, Herbert realized, they're picking us off. At the same time that Lieutenant King had directed Lance Corporal Herbert's point squad to fall back toward his roadside CP, at the leftward-leaning T-junction, he had also called forward Corporal Haynes's squad, which was on rear security. From there, King wanted them to move forward into the fray developing around Herbert's squad, and leading the way, Haynes sprinted some 30 meters up Route 561. Haynes then knelt along one side of the road and waved his squad on by ones and twos to a bomb crater across the trail from him. The first two Marines made it to the crater, then crossed onto a deep ditch on Haynes's side of the road. Haynes motioned the third man, Reed, to come on, and for a fat man Reed moved out, canteens flapping at his hips, his run speeded along by the AK fire now beginning to crack at them. Under fire, Reed made it to the crater, then over to the ditch, followed in turn by Harshman. The fifth man, Hendry, jumped to his feet and began the road run in a crouch, pausing for an instant, near the command group, when he passed Corporal Garza who had his M60 pointing north from the left side of the road. Hendry dropped his 100-round belt of machine gun ammunition there with a forced, "Cool, here's a present for ya, TJ." Garza just nodded, his face as uptight as Hendry's must also have been. Hendry completed his up-the-trail sprint with a leap toward the crater. He landed on the steep side of it, hit loose dirt, and rolled to the bottom, then clambered back up and tailed Harshman to the ditch across the road. One at a time like this, Haynes got his squad in the ditch as NVA fire continued to snap by, mostly from a tree line across a fairly barren field to their left at about the 11 o'clock position. When the fire slackened a bit, Captain Coates, who was walking up and down Route 561 and occasionally firing his .45 into the brush, shouted at Haynes to get his 2D platoon squad online with the 1st squad that had come up from 1st platoon. Together, they were to assault the enemy-held tree line at 11 o'clock. Haynes slid over to Hendry to tell him he would be point for the squad. Hendry's guts knotted even tighter and that he should first go for a dead tree 30 meters ahead. The rest of the squad assault line would follow. Hendry, tensed, waiting, hoped that air support would precede their assault. It didn't. Nor was artillery being directed onto the enemy. Captain Coates hollered at Haynes to get his people moving, and Hendry ran to the dead tree in a terrified zigzag, then hit the deck the instant he reached it. To his left, he could see the 1st platoon squad. They were pinned toward him, followed by the rest of the squad who all made it to the dead tree without casualty. The NVA had not spotted them as they poured their fire into the other squad. When Haynes got close enough to Hendry to be heard, he shouted at him to run the 25 meters more to a hedgerow across their front. Terrified again, Hendry was up and moving again, but this time the NVA saw him. And as he bellied down, rounds kicked up dirt all around, sending him head first over the lip of a nearby bomb crater. He exposed only enough of his head then to watch the flank while somehow the rest of the squad wormed their way through the fire and crawled into the safe haven of the crater. Their job, however, was not to hunker down but to assault, and Haynes now told Hendry to crawl through the short elephant grass to tie in with the squad from 1st platoon. This Hendry did, going prone beside a Marine from the other squad at about the time Captain Coates could be heard bellowing from the road, "Fire for superiority." The 1st platoon Marine beside Hendry opened fire. But an NVA machine gun quickly returned the fire, and he caught a round in the jaw. An RPG flashed in, the explosion hitting several more in that squad, and any man who exposed his position in the brush by firing, instantly had that NVA machine gun blasting at him. The NVA were dug in and could see everything. The Marines did not have a single target to square their sights on. Nothing in the NVA tree line could be seen moving. Fire for superiority? Hendry thought with anger and horror, what in the hell is this? We need some shit here, man. We don't need to be flinging rocks. We need stuff napalm, 500-pound bombs. Then maybe we'd have something going on. The Marines' fire petered out. A sergeant yelled back that the NVA fire was too heavy to advance any further, and Captain Coates gave the word to pull back. Too late. The 2 squads were pinned down. Now the NVA tried to surround them. Hendry had eased back to where Haynes was, to find out what he should do, when Hat Eisen started yelling about NVA going around their right flank. Hendry looked up and there the little bastards were, streaking through the brush and on across the road to take up positions about 100 meters north of their pinned-down situation. They could hear Corporal Garza, back at the crossroad with Lieutenant King, placing M60 fire on the suddenly exposed NVA, but it was not enough. There were too many NVA, and they kept coming. With NVA now on both sides of the road and nothing but open field between them and the rest of the company on the road, Hendry, Hat Eisen, and Harshman jumped into another crater. They opened fire on the NVA still dashing across the road. They fired on the NVA in the brush on their pith helmets and bush hats as well as on their packs and web gear, and around their arms and legs, the NVA were almost impossible to see. Finally, Hendry made out 3 of them, running into a particular patch of brush to the east, on the opposite side of Route 561. It was about a 100-meter shot, but M79 man Harshman dropped his first round directly into the brush. After the explosion, 1 shrapnel-peppered NVA hobbled out of the brush. Hat Ison shot him and then, of course, an NVA shot hit the crater edge beside Hattison's head. The assholes were everywhere. After having his platoon sergeant, radioman, corpsman, and point man all killed in the first moments of the attack on 2D platoon, Lance Corporal Herbert scrambled into a small bomb crater where 3 other Marines had also sought shelter. He had no idea what was going on except that 2 of his men, a grenadier and a fire team leader, were off away from the crater and were yelling to him, "Can we come over? Can we come over?" Herbert responded in the negative. He knew there was an NVA near them because the last shot that had killed his radioman had apparently come from a dugout near the crater. They had to knock that NVA out before those 2 Marines could make it over, but the M79 man didn't understand this and, despite Herbert's shout, he got to all fours to make his move. The NVA shot him in the face. Herbert heard the shot but had no idea his grenadier had been hit until the man came scrambling into the crater on all fours, screaming, "I'm hit," and, just then, the NVA fired again, shooting the man in the side as he tumbled into the crater. Herbert thought the guy was dead. And the guy thought he was dead too. But upon examination it turned out that the last shot had deflected off his flak jacket, and although the face shot had gone through his cheek and shattered half his teeth, it had exited through his open mouth. The M79 man was in a lot of pain but could still function, and Herbert turned his attention to the fire team leader who was still stuck out there and hollering to see if it was okay for him to come over. "No. Wait." Herbert pulled the pin on a grenade, shouted at the team leader to come running as soon as the grenade went off, then threw it toward the dugout where he thought the NVA was. The team leader made it to the crater safely, but an NVA behind some bushes heaved a Chi-Com grenade at them. It landed near the crater and they ducked down, sweating until they realized it was a dud. One of the Marines threw a grenade back. It too was a dud, but his second grenade roared. No more chickums. No more anything, actually, except an occasional AK-47 burst. Herbert concluded that the NVA must have considered his craterful of survivors too meaningless to do more than keep pinned, as their main body pressed the attack on the rest of the platoon. There were NVA climbing up in the trees to fire down on the pinned-down squad from 1st Platoon and the pinned-down squad from 2D Platoon, and PFC Henderson of the 1st was among those firing back at them. This was insane. A fury of M16, M60, and M79 fire would shatter tree branches and vegetation, and if they were lucky, a body might crash heavily back to earth, but more NVA kept coming. And one by one, Marines were being picked off. Then the NVA began mortaring them, and Henderson, squeezing flat, suddenly felt something heavy hit him and his radio was blown off his back, landing as twisted scrap to one side. Henderson hadn't gotten a scratch. Insane. He saw the brush move then, and he started laying down M16 fire until, almost immediately, he was shot in the back, the round punching through his flak jacket and into his shoulder and the blood instantly gushing from a severed artery. Henderson rolled away to where he thought he was unseen on a little footpath, but he was just starting to put a bandage on the bullet hole when he was shot again. The bullet hit him high up on his leg like a paralyzing sledgehammer. "They got me spotted, so I best be still." Now the bushes were moving, and NVA were suddenly becoming visible. It was too much to take. Marines began running back toward the road, running for their lives, and Henderson, a bloody mess, was ignored. It was the final disillusionment, and he thought bitterly that all the indoctrination in boot camp about Marines never leaving their wounded, never leaving their dead, was a bunch of shit. Everybody's running. All were running except one man, PFC Maurice K. Mock, from Henderson's squad, who saw Henderson and exclaimed, "Oh my God." Mock knelt quickly beside Henderson and used his K-bar knife to cut away Henderson's trouser leg so he could to stop the bleeding and heft Henderson onto his shoulders. Mock was shot in the back of his head, the exit of the round grotesquely blowing his face away and dropping his body atop Henderson. Kia. Up ahead, in the eye of Bravo 2's storm, Corporal Haynes got the attention of Hendry, Hat Ison, and Harshman. They crawled from their crater with rounds snapping all around them, then, they jumped up to follow Haynes. They ran top speed to their left toward the Bravo-1 squad, but with AK-47 bursts continuing to crack and ricochet all around them in the open, Hendry and Haynes dived into the dirt behind a log. Hendry, looking around, could no longer see several of the men from his squad, including some who just moments before had started this run behind Haynes. CPL Delma L. Reed was Kia. LCPL Caesar E. Carvalho was Kia. LCPL Stephen W. Harshman was Kia. LCPL Jeffrey S. Hattison was Kia. Hendry had no idea. All he knew was that the NVA fire was increasing until he and Haynes had no choice but to get up and start running again. Demers and a grunt from 1st Platoon joined them as they sprinted south past several dead Marines and several wounded Marines too. They did not stop for them. 2 men helping 1 wounded make 3 dead, Hendry thought. They made it to a cement well and knelt beside it, only to have more rounds ricochet off it in showers of concrete, and again they were up and running, this time into a nearby north-south gully with large stalks of bamboo along the sides. The 1st Platoon Marine was in the lead, followed by Demers, and then Hendry. 30 feet to their front, a bush suddenly leaped to its feet. It was another camouflaged enemy soldier and emptied his AK-47's 30-round banana clip into them. The lead Marine was shot in the head, Kia and Demers in the arm, as Hendry dropped and came back up with a grenade from his grenade pouch ready in his hand. The NVA had disappeared. Hendry tossed the grenade over a small knoll, hoping their ambusher has sought shelter there. Then he tied a dressing around Demers's arm as Haynes came forward with 8 or 9 other survivors from the 2 mixed-up squads. The rest of the company was to the east, somewhere on the other side of a 15-foot-high embankment. They all started scrambling up it. Hendry and 2 other Marines crested it first and were horrified to see 80 meters of naked, coverless earth between their embankment and Route 561. Immediately after popping up, the Marine on Hendry's right was hit from behind, and he arched his back and flipped over onto it, screaming the whole time, "Oh my God, no, no, oh my God." Hendry ducked back down. 2 Marines crawled past him, trying to make their break to the right, but another invisible NVA opened fire from the bamboo 20 meters away. Kia! Kia! The NVA had anticipated the direction of their retreat. Hendry looked back at a man getting up on his hands and knees to make a run for it. He was hit in the jaw and arm, then in the side. Kia! Corporal Haynes called to Hendry to get back up the embankment. "Get fucked. I'll go if you go." Barking back that if they lived he intended to have Hendry court-martialed, Haynes did indeed make his own move, and Hendry jumped up to follow him straight across that 80 meters of open field. Rounds hit all around them. They crawled. Hendry felt terrible. He could hear wounded buddies screaming in pain, screaming for help from the other side of the embankment. He knew the NVA would kill them. He kept crawling until halfway across. Haynes stopped to catch his breath. Lying flat behind him, Hendry looked from under his helmet brim and noticed a dirt clod a foot or 2 to the front right of his head. Another shot, the dirt clod disintegrated, and Hendry was spurred on, pushing himself forward while staying as flat as possible, cheek to the ground, every muscle straining to move. A round grazed his arm, leaving a streak of red, but he hardly felt it. It only drove him faster. Haynes and Hendry were crawling, but a machine gunner suddenly flashed past them, running at an astonishing speed and jumping over the berm and down to safety on the road despite a hail of fire. When Haynes got to within 10 feet of Route 561, he leaped to his feet and ran, making it, even as Hendry behind him kept crawling with bullets smacking into the dirt so close his ears were ringing. Finally, he too shot to his feet and jumped over the berm with enemy fire roaring past. He'd made it. Back down on the sunken road, Hendry passed Garza and his still blazing M60 and scooted across the road to Lieutenant King. He was feeling good, he knew they were out of it now. He gave the lieutenant a little wave and asked where Haynes had gone. King started to answer and the instantly numbing, sledgehammer impact of a bullet caught Hendry full in the hip, knocking him down. He rolled off the exposed road into a shallow ditch on the northern edge of the east to west trail running into Route 561. He was feeling no pain, despite the through-and-through bullet wound, and was plenty happy. He joked to the Marines in the ditch with him, Hughes and Piggott, that he'd just gotten his second 48-hour heart. He was going home. He'd made it through hell to get back to the lieutenant, and there was no way a medevac wouldn't be forthcoming. He was going to see his family again. Piggott hollered for a doc, but as the corpsmen started for their ditch, he was shot in the back. Kia. The NVA were pressing their attack onto Route 561. Nowhere was safe. PFC Weldon of Bravo-2, having lost contact with everyone in his squad, and unaware that his superb squad leader, Sergeant Clopton, was a Kia, was zigzagging south through the brush west of Route 561. In something of a panic, hoping to find somebody else in olive drab. Weldon passed a 12-foot-high pile of concrete junk, the remains of a demolished hutch. The rubble sprawled on into a nice, deep L-shaped trench occupied by 2 Marines. Weldon thankfully piled in with them. "What's going on? Where are you guys from?" "We're from 1st Platoon." No other Marines were visible to Weldon, but almost immediately, he spotted an NVA some 50 meters to their rear. The pith-helmeted, camouflaged NVA was moving in a bush-to-bush crouch, west to east, toward Route 561. Weldon and his 2 new buddies opened fire, and the surprised NVA pivoted, firing back. And then he spun, hit, and fell out of sight. Another NVA appeared, rushing into the brush where his comrade had fallen, but he was forced to jump out of sight as the 3 M16s were turned on him. More NVA appeared, including some to the left of the rubble pile, whose virtually point-blank AK-47 fire sent dirt kicking up along the edge of the trench as the Marines bobbed up to return fire. Weldon kept his M16 blasting rearward, while the other 2 concentrated on the NVA rushing into positions beyond the rubble pile to their front. An M16 jammed and, angry and panicked, the Marine screamed to see if either of the other 2 had a ramrod. Weldon did, and slipping it from its compartment in his rifle stock, he handed it over to the defenseless Marine. Weldon reshouldered his M16. He was firing again and the Marine on his left was in the process of clearing his weapon when clack 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 there was one big burst from the rubble pile, an AK-47, and Weldon's feet flipped out from under him, and he was suddenly face to the sky. Half of his left biceps was gone, he was left-handed. But he was in shock, stunned, the pain wasn't registering yet. His feet were propped upon some rubble in the trench, higher than his head, an odd, uneven position, and he knew that the NVA would be rushing the trench. He knew he had to respond. His M16 had landed on some of the shattered concrete in the trench near his right hand and his fingers wrapped around the pistol grip as he realized there was an NVA standing atop the rubble pile, looking down on them with his AK-47. He saw the man's pith helmet and fatigues. Everything was happening in the eternity of a few seconds, and he saw that the NVA was laughing and shouting excitedly in Vietnamese. The NVA was not looking directly at his victims, and in a flash, Weldon, still on his back, lifted the M16 up one-handed, swung it in the right direction, and firing with the wrong hand, squeezed a burst into the NVA's head and chest. The man tumbled out of sight over the back end of the rubble pile. Weldon realized then that the 2 Marines with him in the trench were not moving. He reached over to one Kia, then the other also Kia, both of them shot across their chests. He crawled from the trench and up the rubble pile to make sure no more NVA were there. He saw the dead one on the other side. Suddenly and utterly alone, he decided to head south again. Crawling through the brush and running across the open areas, Weldon could hear tons of firing. Here, there, and everywhere, but he didn't know if any of it was meant specifically for him. And he was too sun-beat and blood-splattered to really care up until the next dash across an open area when he felt a sudden sharp pain across his ass cheeks that hurled him off his feet. He landed face down in the dirt, and wildly relieved to see his helmet and M16 lying right in front of him, within arm's reach, he scooped them back up and scrambled to his feet. He charged on into the bushes with a new Wound, a bullet-torn crease across his butt. Lieutenant Delaney's attempts to make sense of the cacophony to the north and west of his bamboo thicket were interrupted by a sniper shot thumping into one of his radio men, the one on the other side of the road. Kia. The radio aerials that brought in the fire support were a favorite NVA target, and it seemed to Delaney that every Marine with a radio basically had a bullseye strapped to his back. He eventually lost all radio contact with Bravo-2, and Bravo-3 had only intermittent contact with Bravo-6, and as he told the 3D Marine Division Historical Section 5 days later, different people were on the phone at different times. It sounded like they were wounded, and each time they came on they didn't know what the situation was. All they could say is, "Somebody get down here and help me. They're all around. They're running through us, throwing grenades." Chapter 8. Run in circles, scream and shout. Sergeant Guiser, the artillery spotter with Alpha Company, had the PRC-25 riding on the back of his radio operator, PFC Ross, turned to the ARTI frequency so that they could eavesdrop on the conversation between their counterparts in Bravo Company and Con Tien. Shouting to make himself heard over the constant automatic weapons fire and explosions, a real nerve-ripping wall of sound. Bravo's FO described a scene of disintegration, of utter chaos and fragmentation. Guiser could have pulled his teeth out in frustration as he listened. This was no skirmish, this was a major battle. And Guiser knew from experience that such realities took time to sink in with higher. So he stood and waited, and listened some more to Bravo Company dying, while his mind raged. When the hell are they going to give us directions to turn east and join them? Sergeant Guiser, who was 23 years old and about as squared away a Marine as one could hope to find, had come to the Marines only because he hadn't received a satisfactory assignment in the Peace Corps. Tinkering with the idea of a career in the Marine Corps, he had volunteered for Vietnam and had talked his way out of a behind-the-wire job with an artillery battery and into the field as a forward observer, originally with 1-4. When 1-4 departed Vietnam for Okinawa to train for redeployment to the combat zone as an amphibious landing team, he had volunteered to join 3-4 so as not to miss any time in the bush, and when 3-4 similarly departed for Okinawa, he had volunteered for 1-9. He had extended his tour in Vietnam and had even refused his RNR. Artillery spotters were supposed to be lieutenants, but Guiser, who, incidentally, had no formal training as an FO, was a sergeant, and his assistant forward observer, David H. Sankey, was only a private first class. PFC Sankey was a full-blooded Arapaho from an Oklahoma reservation, a quiet, likable, trustworthy man in the field, but also a man who struck Guiser as serious and melancholy. When he spoke, which was not often, he gave the impression that was hungry for something he wasn't finding. Sankey was straight as an arrow in the bush, but in the rear there was an alcoholic and resistor of authority to the point that his escapades with his partner in crime, Corporal Power, kept his sleeves bare of chevrons. Guiser and Sankey had 2 radio men assigned to them, PFC Ross and PFC Russell Duckworth. Since Ducky was the sharper of the 2, he was a tough, wiry, little fireball. Guiser gave him to Sankey, while Guiser, with 16 months of bush experience to lean on, kept the quiet, unassuming Ross. Finally, Captain Slater got off the radio with the CP at Con Tien. Alpha Company was to turn around and hump back south through the overnight position they had not yet completely uncoiled from, then turn east and reinforce Bravo Company's fight from the rear. By the time they were into their forced march, the man on the ARTI frequency that Guiser was listening to over Ross's bitch box was literally crying his eyes out and begging for help. "Hey, what the fuck's going on over there?" Radio operators, even ones who were not supposed to be on Bravo's nets, were changing their frecks over as they walked. One radioman said, "Bravo says there's 1,000,000 of them motherfuckers over there." The word spread mouth to mouth. Bravo's gettin' the shit bad, man. They're begging, they're pleading, they're gettin' fucking rubbed out, man. Bravo is fucking dying over there, boys. Let's go. Everyone in Alpha was getting real nervous, real uptight, but they moved it out, walking a rapid single file through dry, waist-high grass and scattered brush, making their own trail. There is a shitload of gooks over there and these motherfuckers have got a shitload of ammo. Corporal Power's mind was racing, even as the other half was locked like radar on his surroundings. He was ready as he strode toward the cacophony to the east. They are not trying to conserve ammo, they are throwing shit on Bravo. Bravo Company's fight was audible, if not visible, to Lieutenant Colonel Skeening, et al. In the CP bunker atop Con then. And despite only intermittent radio contact with Captain Coates, it became obvious to these blind men that this was a battle Bravo Company might lose. Skeening told Coates to hang on. He had directed Alpha Company to move overland to them, he had alerted Charlie Company at Dong Ha to helicopter into the strip, and he had directed Delta Company at Con Tien to organize a tank infantry relief force. The temptation for Spike Skeening, of the gruff manner and thrice-wounded experience, to join his Marines in the field was strangled by his primary mission to hold Con Tien. It was impossible to calculate whether Bravo Company had encountered an NVA company, battalion, or regiment. It was impossible to anticipate whether Bravo Company could hold and, if they could not, whether waves of NVA would then be darting through the wire at Con Tien. As Major Danielson noted, Lieutenant Colonel Skeening would have been conspicuously in violation of his primary mission had he abandoned Con Tien. He had no choice. Despite the poor communications, though, he had better control from Con Tien than he would have ever had from the trace or with one of the companies involved. PFC Henderson of Bravo 1 lay aching and momentarily apathetic on the footpath with the body of PFC Mock sprawled atop him. With a bullet wound in his hip and another in his shoulder, it took much effort for Henderson to finally push Mock off. It was time to start thinking about surviving this debacle, and after retrieving his M16 and his dead buddy's K-bar knife, he forced himself to crawl back down the footpath toward Route 561. 10 painful meters later, Henderson realized he had found a little perimeter of fellow survivors. They had pulled in tight with their backs to a big, thick, protective clump of bamboo, several seriously wounded Marines gathered there with 4 slightly wounded Marines spread out in a half-circle away from the bamboo as a perimeter of sorts. No one was bandaged yet. There were other Marines spread out here and there in the area, which was under intermittent mortar attack from tubes firing from so close that they could hear the pop of each outgoing shell. Luckily, the NVA ammunition was full of duds, which the Marines could hear thudding into the dirt near them. It was nerve-wracking, and Henderson soon realized that these Marines were in a state of panic. There were a lot of boots in Bravo Company, and they were so scared they wouldn't shut up. "Can we get out of here now?" "No, stay put until Charlie gets here." "What do we do now?" "What do we do?" "Fools," Henderson thought as he whispered harshly to the closest of them, "Shut up, shut up." But they kept babbling, and Henderson finally saw the inevitable Chi-Com grenade come over from some bushes, tumbling end over end to land near him. The Marines with him scurried away, but Henderson couldn't move anymore. Boom! It hurt so bad that when he looked down at his right leg he half expected to see that it had been blown off. It hadn't, but a large chunk of shrapnel had smashed bloodily into his calf. Someone blasted the brush from where the grenade had come and shouted that he'd gotten that gook. That shut the new guys up for a while, and since no one else seemed to care enough anymore, the bleeding enraged. Henderson tried to honcho the group, telling them to keep quiet and stay alert. These Marines had no idea who Henderson was, and when they answered him, they called him Sarge. Other Marines were going absolutely apeshit. One rushed around in front of the bamboo, fired off a magazine, then dropped it to the ground, and thumped in a fresh magazine as he rushed to a new position. In one squeeze of the trigger, he emptied that magazine, then jumped back down. Henderson, watching him, wanted to scream that they didn't have that kind of ammunition to waste. Insane. They were also supposed to police up their empty magazines, not just drop them in the dirt because they didn't have very many. And if they ever got the boxed rounds out of their packs that had been left behind, they'd need them to reload. Bushes were moving around them, so there was reason to fire. At least for as long as one could. Damn it, my rifle jammed. This pissed-off curse became a chorus in the little perimeter. Before long it seemed that every other Marine had an M16 in his hands, rendered useless by unextracted brass, which could only be cleared with a ramrod. Problem was that, though every man was supposed to have one, the supply system had not provided them in such abundance. A guy would give his left leg for an M16 that was working, Henderson thought, as he watched Marines without ramrods frantically bang their rifles against trees to dislodge the jams. That didn't work, and it didn't work when they tried to pry the brass out with sticks. Insane, insane, insane. PFC Weldon of Bravo-2 ended his rearward running and crawling in a crater marked by the small, uprooted, and upside-down banana tree in it. He bandaged his shot away, badly bleeding left biceps. By sitting in the dirt he also unknowingly stopped the bleeding from his bullet-creased ass, then took a solid hit from his canteen. He realized he was getting weak, so he crawled to the bottom of the crater and propped himself up against the tree, rising up every now and again to look around. Weldon heard someone coming. He pointed his M16 toward the noise. Luckily his reflexes were good, because what came into view, with his weapon also at the ready, was one of the company's attached combat engineers. They knew each other. The engineer, a lance corporal, piled into the crater, tied Weldon's bandage a little better, and appraised their situation. "Well, we're not doing any good here." Weldon followed the engineer out of the crater and back toward the crossroad where Bravo-1 was deployed. They found some Marines on the west side of Route 561, but they wanted to get across the road to join the main body on the other side. An NVA machine gunner was firing, returning his fire, and Weldon and the engineer were able to make their move. They joined the others hiding behind various pieces of cover. Weldon rolled into a roadside trench, but even here, he realized, there was no real perimeter. Helter-skelter, Weldon thought as NVA mortar crews worked the crossroad area, putting, it seemed, around every 5 meters. Anything that walks or moves, they're definitely putting a hurting to. Shot in the leg and chest, LCPLJ, Skinner of Bravo-3, lucky enough to have had survived the massacre that had occurred on point, was also lucky enough to happen upon Lance Corporal Herbert's ignored little group from Bravo-2. One of Herbert's men jumped out of their crater to grab Skinner as he came past. Skinner was bad, and they gave him all their canteen water to keep him up, as they waited and waited and waited. Lance Corporal Herbert finally couldn't stand it any longer. On the verge of heatstroke from the direct sunlight pounding the crater, he crawled out to lie in the miserable shade of a nearby tree. There was a rim of raw, upturned earth about 15 feet away, and Herbert didn't understand that it was a bomb crater until an NVA stuck his head up from it, looking around. He was probably keeping tabs on the crater for the return of his comrades. The NVA was to his right, and being a right-handed shooter, Herbert had to switch his M16 to his left hand before he could trigger a quick burst to the right. The NVA dropped back down, and no idea whether he'd hit the man or not, Herbert immediately wheeled around to face the crater. He waited. Every now and then, an NVA would shoot at him from another location now that he'd exposed his position with that burst. But he stayed flat and motionless, and eventually, that NVA decided to stick his head up again, but he didn't see Herbert, who, thus, had time to square his sights on the man's head. Then he squeezed the trigger. Finally, PFC Hendry thought when looking up from his trailside ditch to see the first 2 F-4B Phantom II jets and 2 UH-1E Huey gunships. A prop-driven 01E Bird Dog observation plane dipped in to mark targets with white phosphorus rockets, and the Phantoms roared in to place their 250 and 500-pound bombs, where the white smoke roiled up from the greenery. Marine air thus killed some of the NVA, while terrifying most of their grunt counterparts only a few meters removed from ground zero. In Hendry's trench, he, Hughes, and Piggott plugged their ears and opened their mouths so their eardrums wouldn't burst as dirt clods and debris from the explosions showered down on them. Over and over again. The Hueys also skimmed low, their M60 machine guns firing incessantly, pursuing NVA who sought cover in the hedgerows and, in the process, tearing apart brush where Marines themselves were huddled. The bird dog marked NVA targets all around Lance Corporal Herbert's isolated crater. The impact of the closest bomb was unreal. Herbert felt like he'd exploded from within. He thought he had a concussion. Bombs and napalm seemed to suck the air right from the lungs of anyone nearby. Then, the Hueys rolled in again. One of Herbert's men had a machine gun round glance off his flak jacket. Herbert popped a green cluster flare, anything, but it didn't do any good. So he tore a yellow smoke grenade from his web gear and threw that from the crater. No result. Either the platoon's dead, Herbert thought, or they've pulled back and given us up for dead. As Alpha Company hurried through the waist-high brush, trying to close that 1,500-meter gap with Bravo Company, NVA snipers fired on them from concealed positions to the north and east, though not from the long, gradual slope to the south, which ran east-west and at whose base the column marched. And the closer they got to Bravo, the heavier the fire on Alpha. These AK and SKS-toting snipers, all poor shots, did not slow Alpha Company down, but the Claymore mine that the point team walked into did. The explosion sent the point man, a radio man, and a rifleman sprawling with shrapnel wounds and sent a fourth man, who had rejoined the company only 2 days earlier after recuperating from Fuan wounds, into shock. Captain Slater decided that Bravo could not afford the time it would take to medevac these four, so he ordered the point platoon to pick up their casualties and to keep moving. Closer still, Alpha Company could see the Phantom supporting Bravo Company. They made their passes from east to west at a slow drag to release their bombs, then, regaining speed and altitude as they completed their passes, they flashed past Alpha's line to their north, flying west as the grunts humped east. As the Phantoms came out of their bombing patterns, the grunts could hear a considerable number of NVA heavy machine guns open fire on them from a tree-lined ridge far to the north. The NVA were swarming all around Bravo Company but also had units all the way north to that ridge line. The distant, muffled reports of those machine guns made everyone realize that this fight was going to be worse than anything originally imagined. That was confirmed in short order when a pair of Huey gunships supporting Bravo peeled off at Alpha Company's approach and proceeded to strafe their point element. Luckily, there were no casualties.